Before home birth midwifery was revived in the 20th century, first-wave feminists felt that women needed to be liberated from childbirth pain. They fought for the right for painless childbirth through experimental anesthesia, ushering in a new era of the twilight sleep generation. They wanted to be free from suffering and the so-called curse of Eve. Following twilight sleep, people were essentially birthing while unconscious, and forceps deliveries were the norm. Obstetric violence was prevalent and normalized. Birthing people had little say in how they birthed, and their partners were removed from the experience. Episiotomies were routinely performed, and many people felt disempowered by their births, mentally and physically traumatized from the experience. Twilight sleep was performed until the 60s, when 99% of births occurred in the hospital. During this time period, American culture as a whole was shifting. This coincided with a social revolution in which midwifery and home birth was brought back. After experiencing birth in the hospital, people began to look for more from their birth experiences. People began to return to the ideas of unmedicated birth, and childbirth education series like Lamaze classes and books like Birthing Without Fear emerged, promoting a message of natural childbearing. The second wave of feminism began to recognize birth culture and reproductive rights as an important aspect of women's liberation. This movement grew alongside a general counterculture movement that was happening. The hippie subculture was growing in communities like California. With the American military conflict in Vietnam, the hippie movement arose across the country. Monday Night Class was a lecture series taught in California by Stephen Gaskin. The lectures centered around existentialism and explored topics like spirituality, psychedelics, and the universe. They gained a following of alternative thinkers and formed community. Followers of the Monday Night Class community formed a caravan of buses which traveled across the United States lecturing. The caravan would pull over when a person was in labor, and untrained midwives such as Ina May Gaskin delivered babies along the route, guided by a training manual written for rural midwives in China. The caravan midwives gained experiential knowledge of midwifery through self-education and eventually some birth emergency training. Ina May preached about the importance of spirituality in birth and how one's mindset and relationship with the universe affected the birth process. The philosophy was that birth was by nature a spiritual experience and could be transformative. Ina May's philosophy was based on the principles that how people birth could be empowering for both the birthing person and also the baby. These principles were also supported by the psychiatric researcher Stan Goff, who primarily studied the psychedelic drug LSD. Goff believed that birth experiences shaped consciousness and that birth trauma had long-lasting impacts on the human spirit. The caravan midwives bought land in Tennessee, where they continued living communally on the farm. Home birth midwifery continued to be practiced for families on the farm. They formed good relationships with local doctors such as John Williams, who supported and encouraged their community midwifery. Farm midwives gained the favor of nursing staff and fostered positive relationships in their communities. While popular culture as a whole is not a place that's accepting of midwifery, we continue to see on a larger scale an alternative and counterculture subsects. It is clear that hippie midwives such as Ina May Gaskin's influence reached far and wide in the American birth culture, and she herself is often credited as the founder of American midwifery. While Resurgence-era hippie midwives like Ina May Gaskin have made great contributions to American midwifery, their legacy is a complicated one and continues to shape contemporary midwifery issues. Their story allows us an opportunity to reflect on the paradigms of racism and privilege that deeply harmed and yet allowed for midwifery to thrive again in America. This midwifery resurgence thrived off of reclaiming white women's birth. The twilight sleep generation occurred while hospitals were still segregated. People of color were not allowed to access these services, and out-of-hospital births were often their only choices, such as African-American granny midwives practicing in the American South. Granny midwives, despite learning from ancestral knowledge and tradition, were criminalized and associated with being dirty and uneducated. In comparison, the hippie midwives were glorified for being self-taught renegades. Their white privilege gained them acceptance in the larger community for doing the same practices that people of color had been keeping alive for centuries. The resurgent generation of midwives is often credited with discovering ancient practices. One of Ina May's most notorious claims to fame, the Gaskin maneuver, was appropriated knowledge from Indigenous practitioners during her time spent training in Guatemala. Commodified images of Indigenous birthing people and ancient statues are commonplace in American midwifery. Midwifery tourism is a phenomenon that boosts midwives' professional status as they learn firsthand from birth practices of third world women while volunteering. Learning from unhealthy outcomes and people in difficult situations and coming back with these skills to be utilized in a white, wealthy community. Midwifery tourism conjures up images of white savior narratives. People living in these tourism centers are being subjected to the experimental learning of amateurs out of desperation. In the same way that these midwives' careers developed off of that knowledge, father of gynecology J. Marion Sims gained his title by experimenting on enslaved black women. At a Texas conference, Ina May blamed Black Americans' lifestyles for maternal health disparities, citing poor diet and drug abuse. It's well established that exposure to and experience of racism produces this inequality. It's also an ironic double standard coming from the trippy hippie psychedelic birther. These examples highlight the need for accountability from midwifery leaders to the historical and intrinsically linked current-day racism and privilege in this field. Ina May's name and story have been elevated to a high platform in our community. It's important to recognize the ways in which she helped to shape midwifery and the ways in which she and others like her have used her platform. This presentation focused on the stories of the hippie midwives and Ina May, but it's important to recognize how many midwives came before them, working tirelessly to hold on to tradition and paving the way for the revivalist success. It's important to elevate those voices and perspectives whenever possible, and recognize the lasting impact of the revivalists in the spotlight.